The classroom was silent, yet the air felt heavy, not with learning, but with shame. A young black girl sat frozen at her desk, her hands trembling as whispers of laughter and cruel words echoed around her. The teacher, the very person meant to protect her, stood watching, and then delivered a cutting remark that pierced deeper than any insult from her peers. She lowered her head, hiding her tears, but inside she whispered a plea no one seemed to hear. Why me? Why is my skin a reason to suffer? What happened next would leave everyone questioning. How far can cruelty go before justice finally speaks? She was just 16, a girl with big dreams tucked neatly into the pages of her worn notebook. Before the sun crept over the horizon every morning, she pressed her uniform carefully, laced her shoes, and whispered to herself that today might be the day someone noticed her effort. School had always been her sanctuary, or at least it was supposed to be. Within those brick walls, she carried the quiet hope that education could lift her above the struggles her family faced outside its gates. The daily battles, nobody in. Her classroom could see. Her mother worked long hours cleaning offices downtown, and her father picked up temporary jobs wherever he could, always returning home exhausted and silent. Yet they never complained. They reminded her that intelligence and diligence were armor against a world that sometimes refused to see your worth. And she believed them, or at least tried to, stacking her books high, scribbling notes late into the night, and repeating mantras that would keep her going. At school, teachers often praised her diligence, and her peers, at least superficially, respected her for being the one who always had the answers when no one else dared to speak. But behind the polite smiles, there lingered something colder, something she pretended not to notice. The glances that lingered a moment too long, the whispers that stopped when she approached, the way her name was sometimes mispronounced with a smirk, as though it didn't deserve to be spoken with care, she catalogued. These moments quietly, like evidence she couldn't yet confront, a group project where her suggestions were ignored until repeated by another student, a teacher giving vague praise to her peers while skimming over her own carefully written assignments. The cafeteria murmurs when she walks past, the subtle laughter that cuts just slightly too close to her back. Little things, almost invisible, but they left a sting that grew heavier with each passing day. Even in moments of apparent normalcy, the tension followed her. Walking to school, she noticed how neighbors sometimes averted their eyes, crossing the street to avoid her. On the bus, passengers whispered just loud enough for her to hear, questioning why she belonged there, as if her presence alone was an intrusion. And though she tried to dismiss it, her body betrayed her. Tight shoulders, racing heart, a quiet ache in her chest she couldn't name. At home, she would sink into her worn chair, opening her notebook and pouring her thoughts onto the pages, the words her only confidants. She wrote about her dreams of becoming a doctor, about helping her community, about the injustices she noticed in the world, and the frustration of feeling powerless. Sometimes she allowed herself to hope that her hard work would outshine the bias around her, that eventually fairness would triumph. But even hope had its limits. Because lately, the cracks in her world had begun to widen. She had started noticing subtle patterns, a teacher's eyes lingering longer on lighter-skinned classmates, a whispered joke about her hair during class that no one corrected, the way her ideas were praised only when repeated by someone else. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a quiet, persistent reminder that her skin made her less visible, less valued, less safe. And yet, she continued. She continued because giving up was not an option. Every morning she walked into the school with her chin high. Every evening she buried herself in her studies. She smiled when classmates made subtle digs, nodded politely when teachers dismissed her contributions, and carried a silent determination that refused to be broken. The days after that first cutting remark at school felt heavier than she had imagined. Every step she took, every glance she caught in a classroom mirror carried the weight of judgment. The whispers had not stopped. They had grown louder, sharper, more pointed. It was as if the walls themselves had decided to conspire against her, echoing every slight, every injustice, until she could no longer ignore them. One morning, she arrived to find her favorite spot in the library taken, not by accident, not by chance, but seemingly reserved for someone else, someone whose skin was lighter, whose smile seemed to make authority figures bend more easily. She hesitated at the entrance, fingers gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. The librarian glanced up, barely acknowledging her, and muttered, almost too softly for anyone else to hear, "You'll have to sit somewhere else?" The words cut deeper than any direct insult could. During class, the unfair treatment became more obvious. Questions she had spent hours preparing were ignored, or worse, dismissed as irrelevant. Another student who had copied her notes repeated the same answer and received praise. Her chest tightened as she forced a polite smile, but inside, anger and confusion battled with self-doubt. She began to question herself, asking silently if she had imagined the bias, if her skin truly dictated how the world valued her. It was in the hallways that the cruelty often sharpened. Groups of students would snicker behind her back, their laughter lingering like smoke in the air she breathed. Someone scrawled words on her locker, cruel jokes disguised as harmless humor. She stared at them, fingernails digging into the metal as a rush of helpless fury surged. And yet, every time she raised the issue with a teacher, the response was polite but empty, a soft, "We'll look into it," that never translated into action. Her determination didn't falter, though it was tested daily. She studied late into the night, sometimes under the dim light of a single bulb in her bedroom, hoping that excellence could protect her or at least give her an escape. But the microaggressions kept piling up. In group activities, she was often given the least important tasks, and her ideas were dismissed or ignored. When she tried to assert herself, classmates would roll their eyes, whispering comments like, "She thinks she's better than us," as if ambition were a crime. Even teachers, who had once praised her, now seemed to participate in the quiet exclusion. In one science lab, she proposed a complex solution to a problem that had stumped the group. The teacher barely glanced at her, then repeated her idea to the class as if it had originated elsewhere and received nods of approval from other students. Her stomach twisted, a mix of humiliation and fury boiling inside her. She wanted to speak up, to demand recognition, but knew that any confrontation could escalate the prejudice she already faced. Then came the overt incidents, the moments where subtlety was abandoned for outright cruelty. One day, a group of students deliberately pushed past her in the crowded hallway, muttering slurs under their breath. She stumbled, barely holding her books, and looked around for help. Teachers were nearby, yet none intervened. It was as if her suffering was invisible, or worse, insignificant. Even outside school, the tension followed her. At the bus stop, a woman turned her face away and whispered something under her breath that made her cheeks burn with humiliation. The local store clerk avoided her gaze, checking ID carefully while letting lighter-skinned customers breeze past. Each interaction reminded her that the world often measured people not by effort, kindness, or talent, but by the color of their skin. Despite the relentless attacks, her resolve strengthened. She began documenting every incident, scribbling details in her notebook, noting dates, times, and names. Each note was a small act of defiance, a reminder that she was not invisible. She whispered to herself that one day the truth would matter more than prejudice. And yet, even as she prepared, the tension escalated to a point where she could no longer predict what the next day would bring. Then came the moment that would redefine everything. During a school assembly, she stood in the back, hoping to remain unnoticed. But a teacher singled her out, accusing her of causing disruptions that she hadn't. Whispers and laughter erupted through the auditorium. Her heart pounded, and the heat of humiliation spread through her body like wildfire. In that instant, every slight, every ignored suggestion, and every whispered insult converged into a storm she could barely withstand. She felt the urge to retreat, to hide in the safety of anonymity, but something inside refused. Something whispered that endurance alone was not enough. She needed to act, to find a way to ensure that injustice didn't simply pass unnoticed. Her mind raced, considering possibilities, imagining the confrontation that might force recognition, that might finally make someone listen. The day arrived, with a weight she could almost touch, a heaviness in the air that made her stomach twist. Something in the atmosphere seemed to signal that today would not be like any other day. Even the hallways felt different, quieter, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She knew she could no longer endure the subtle cruelties and whispered insults. The small, invisible wounds had grown into a storm inside her, and she felt it pressing, urgent, demanding release. It started in the classroom, the scene of so many slights and dismissals. A test was being handed back, and for a moment she dared to hope. Perhaps her hard work had finally been recognized. But the teacher's eyes skimmed over her paper, then paused, a smirk curling at the corner of their mouth. "I suppose this is acceptable for someone like you," they said, loud enough for the entire class to hear. Laughter rippled through the room, sharp and cutting, and the air seemed to thicken with disdain. Her hands clenched into fists beneath her desk. Heat surged through her body, a mix of shame, rage, and determination. This wasn't just another slight. It was a declaration that her existence, her intelligence, her very being was up for public judgment. She felt the eyes of classmates on her, some avoiding her gaze, others grinning, enjoying the spectacle. She wanted to shrink into the floor, disappear, but a spark ignited in her chest, a whisper from deep inside. "This stops today." She picked up her books, eyes scanning the crowd. Every mocking glance, every laugh, every subtle dismissal flashed in her mind. The years of microaggressions, the ignored achievements, the whispered words that no one thought she could hear. And then she did something no one expected. She stood in the middle of the courtyard, lifted her voice, clear, strong, and unyielding. "Enough!" The word cut through the chatter like a blade. Silence fell, heavy and trembling. All eyes turned to her. She could feel the heat of their stares, the shock, the disbelief. "How many times do I have to prove myself?" she continued, voice trembling but steady. "How many times do I have to be overlooked, laughed at, dismissed, because of the color of my skin? I am not invisible. I am not less than anyone else here." The murmurs started to rise again, but this time she didn't falter. She recounted one by one the injustices she had endured. The ignored assignments, the stolen ideas, the whispered slurs, the shoves, the smirks that had become routine. Her voice shook with anger and pain, but she pressed on, each word a hammer, striking against the walls of apathy that had surrounded her. And then she did the unexpected. She turned to the teacher who had humiliated her in front of everyone and held their gaze. "You," she said, her voice unwavering now, "stood by and let this happen. You chose to laugh with them, to dismiss me, to act as if I was less. That is your choice, but my worth is not determined by your cruelty." The courtyard was silent. Shock, disbelief, and finally, whispers of acknowledgement rippled through the crowd. Some students looked ashamed, some confused, some frightened by her boldness. But she didn't wait for their approval. She had spoken her truth. She had taken control of the narrative that had been dictated by cruelty and bias for far too long. Then, a visitor she hadn't seen before entered the courtyard. A prominent figure in the community, a billionaire known for philanthropy and support for underprivileged students, had come to witness a school event. His eyes fell on her, noticing the fire, the courage, the raw honesty in her stance. Without a word, he approached, and the crowd parted instinctively, as if they sensed the gravity of the moment. He extended a hand, not of judgment but of recognition. "I've been watching," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "And what you've endured is unacceptable. But your courage is remarkable. I want to help you." The teacher who had ridiculed her shrank back, their authority crumbling under the weight of exposure. The students who had mocked her could only stare, realizing that their cruelty had not gone unnoticed. And in that instant, the scales shifted. For the first time, she felt the vindication that had seemed impossible, the proof that perseverance and dignity could confront systemic injustice. Yet even in triumph, the tension remained. She knew that this confrontation, this revelation, was only the beginning. The world beyond that courtyard was vast, and the biases she had faced were embedded in far more than just her school. But for this moment, she had won. She had broken the silence, forced acknowledgement, and turned cruelty into a catalyst for change. As the crowd dispersed, leaving whispers and stunned glances behind, she held her head high. The fire that had been growing inside her for months was now uncontainable. And even as the billionaire spoke of opportunities, mentorship, and a brighter path, one thought lingered. This is only the beginning.